Hello, I'm Nicole Gauthier, Associate Professor of Plant Pathology at the University of Kentucky. Today I'm going to talk about the survival and overwintering potential of disease agents or the plant pathogens that cause disease. And because I'm a fruit pathologist, I'm going to be looking at it from a fruit perspective, but these are general concepts that can be applied to any disease situation, and you will see that once you understand them, they can indeed be applied to multiple crops, landscapes, etc. So what are disease agents? Those are the plant pathogens that can cause disease. Recall that disease is the symptom. Disease is what manifests upon infection. But the infective agent or the disease-causing agent are the pathogens such as bacteria, fungi, water molds, also known as oomycetes, viruses, and nematodes. So as a whole, that's what we think about as disease-causing agents. About 85% of plant diseases are caused by fungi. So fungi are typically the number one group of plant pathogens. And so a lot of times you'll see through the photos in this short slideshow that a lot of these diseases are indeed fungal diseases. So where do plant diseases come from? Or where do these pathogens come from? Do they just appear in the orchard? What's their source? So a lot of times they'll come in on your planting stock, whether it's a perennial or an annual crop. They can come in on your planting stock, infected, maybe not showing disease, or maybe they are showing disease and the grower doesn't realize it. They can also be just coming in from nearby plants, whether that's weeds or whether that's other crops, previous crops, nearby crops. And that would be some of these pathogens with a broad host range. Okay, so some pathogens have a broad host range, others would have a very narrow host range. So it really sort of depends. And again, I'm generalizing here, but so pathogens can come from a lot of places. Pathogens also don't just appear from nowhere. Once they're introduced, they'll begin as low levels and they'll ramp up over time. Usually when we have the perfect environmental conditions, maybe plant stress, you'll see outbreaks. But overall, a lot of these pathogens are usually in an orchard at low levels a lot of time. All right, so how do they persist? How do they survive? What's going on there? And there are multiple mechanisms for survival, but some of the most common ones are that the pathogen will enter a saprophytic stage, or to survive off of already dead or already decomposed material. So they'll have a phase where they can survive on debris or broken down material. Um, if they are specifically pathogenic, they might develop some kind of survival structure to overwinter or to oversummer, or they may depend on another crop, whether it's a weed or whether it's another actual horticultural crop, to survive until the primary crop comes back into, whether it's active growth or to be planted to come back into the field. And we'll use that term green bridge. So it's some other green plant that's bridging the gap in between crops. So survival can occur in a lot of ways. Today, I am more focusing on the survival structures, or how they go into a dormant sort of phase to wait until there's an opportunity to reinfect. So where, in fact, do these plant pathogens overwinter? Let's take a closer look at those specific sites. First of all, it's leaves. So we know leaf spots, leaf diseases will typically overwinter on fallen leaves. Leaves will fall down to the orchard floor or at the bottom of the field, and the pathogen will survive on that leaf debris until the next spring, when that pathogen breaks its dormancy and splashes back up into the canopy, back onto healthy, succulent, susceptible tissue. Pathogens can also overwinter on fruit. So particularly fruit rot pathogens will likely overwinter on fallen fruit that's left in the field over the winter. And usually that's some kind of survival structure as well that will allow that pathogen to remain there in that fruit. This is bitter rot. And this is in our research orchard, so it gets the worst of abuse. But those apples that have fallen onto the ground will harbor the pathogen over the winter. So it's not just fallen fruit that can serve for sites for overwintering. Fruit mummies, and we use the term mummy just as a hard, shriveled fruit that does not drop from the tree. So this is this example, the apple is killed by fire blight, but other pathogens have moved into those shriveled fruit, and they are going to overwinter in that dried fruit. So those fruit can still be hanging on the tree. Stems and branches, so woody plant diseases, those that cause cankers and tip blights, will typically overwinter on the site of that canker. This is fire blight. This is a bacterial pathogen, but some of your fungal pathogens will do much the same thing. So this is pretty much the site that that pathogen is going to overwinter. And then, of course, there are fungal cankers that will serve as the site for overwintering of that particular pathogen. So, for example, with black rot, which is a cankering disease of apple, black and white rot, both Botryosphaeria species, those will overwinter the particular pathogen, cause cankers, cause fruit rots, but we have research that confirms that, for instance, the bitter rot pathogen Calototricum can also move in and overwinter in those sites. And then finally, roots and soil can be an overwintering site, particularly for soil-borne pathogens. Those that either overwinter in dead and diseased roots, or spore structures, survival structures that can dislodge and overwinter in the soil itself, and those will move around in soil particles or attach to soil particles. So soil-borne pathogens will typically overwinter in roots or in soil, or a combination of the two. So what does all this mean? In the context of disease management, how can we use the survival and overwintering information to help manage disease? And that's the big question, right? Well, cultural practices means the practices we use that do not include fungicide applications, that we use for culturing and maintaining our planting. So we can use those types of practices in the context of survival and overwintering. So that can be preventing and avoiding the pathogen from the start, not introducing it in so that we don't have overwintering occurring, or it can mean sanitation and removal of diseased tissue so that it does not have the opportunity to overwinter. And then finally, we can consider rotating out of a susceptible crop, especially if we have a host-specific pathogen. We can rotate out of a crop for a selected length of time so that that overwintering inoculum falls by the wayside, and that we're breaking that cycle. So we can use resistant species and resistant cultivars in a rotation. And here is an example. This is our research orchard, and this is what you would think is an extreme example of sanitation and keeping things clean. But in fact, we do see this. Sometimes growers just become overwhelmed, or if there's a disease outbreak, and they tell us we just can't get everything up. But in terms of, this is an example of a fruit rot outbreak, but that is overwintering source, an extreme overwintering source, that pathogen is building in numbers. So the following season, there will be that much more inoculum in that orchard or under that tree planting. So quick checklist: strategies for managing plant disease in the context of overwintering and pathogen survival. Preventing, roguing, that means tossing it out, digging it up and cutting your losses. Pruning, so that's particular for cankers, pruning out disease material and getting it out of the orchard. raking, picking fruit that are diseased so that they don't stay in the planting on the plant, cleaning your equipment, cleaning your tools, tilling under. Some disease material needs to be on top of the ground in order to overwinter. So sometimes tilling it in will help break that cycle, help it decompose. And like I said earlier, rotating to non-susceptible crops. So as we get to the end here, I really want to stress that that it's important to know that survival and overwintering potential can be used as a tool to consider disease management, but that's not a tool that will stand alone. So using only sanitation and only to break that inoculum cycle, well, we're not going to hit that 100% mark. So this can be one part of a disease management program. A small planting, a small grower, a backyard grower can usually use this practice much more successfully than maybe a large operation, a large orchard that just has a lot of trees or a large planting. So this is part of a holistic approach to disease management. Also, we usually talk about fungicides when we talk about disease management, but consider that fungicides cannot stand alone either. They are part of a holistic program. We call that IPM. It's part of more of a holistic approach because the inoculum load of overwintering pathogens can overload a fungicide program. So it works both ways. So this is a bigger disease program. All right, so some parting thoughts. Consider that pathogens can build up from year to year. Usually they'll start at low levels, and as they overwinter each year, you'll have an exponential increase in the amount of that inoculum or those pathogen propagules in the orchard. I've generalized a lot of things here today, but persistence depends on the specific pathogen, how persistent they are, how well they overwinter, where they overwinter, how easy it is to manage them by breaking that overwintering cycle. That all really depends on specific pathogens, and we can help growers with those. Pathogenicity, and that can mean aggressiveness, for example, the amount of spores that will be produced. That all varies by the specific pathogen. So you have to touch on those each individually. And like I said earlier, inoculum can overload fungicides. So the amount of that pathogen in the orchard can be too much for fungicides to be effective. So even if you're using a fungicide regime, consider overwintering, using sanitation, breaking those cycles is critical. All right, and finally, we talk about IPM. Everyone talks about IPM, and it's easy to forget what IPM means. IPM is the integrated pest management, so it's the integration of multiple strategies, including this one, to manage pests and diseases. And that's what we're doing here. We're integrating this breaking of the disease cycle to prevent or interfere with the overwintering cycle so that we can have more of a holistic disease management program. Okay, and finally, if you are a Kentucky grower, you can find all of our resources on the Plant Pathology, Department of Plant Pathology website. We have fact sheets. We've got cultural calendars to help you understand what's happening in these disease cycles. And our fact sheets can be specific per disease, and there are county agents and specialists that can help you work through specifics. If you are out of the state of Kentucky, please resort to your local county agent and your local extension service because they will have information on the specifics of your region and your crops.